Welcome to Atheist Talk. My name is Grant Steves and I'm the host for this program. Tonight our program is going to be on Buddhism, the Foundation. And my guest to speak about this subject is Ted Meissner. Ted has been a Buddhist, a practicing Buddhist, and he is also a practicing atheist. And he's going to fill us in terms of his background with Buddhism, coming out into the world of Buddhism. At what age were you?
A number of years ago, probably about a dozen or so years ago.
Okay.
I'd been raised in a secular household, so the idea of an atheist background has always been a part of my upbringing, and we'd always encouraged questioning and wondering, gee, what kind of a practice do we actually want to have? Buddhism was something that came much later on.
Okay. And when did this first occur, though, the Buddhism itself? When did you say about 12 years ago, what precipitated that first encounter with the Buddhist community?
At that time, many people tend to come to Buddhism either through some great suffering that they've had, the standard coping mechanisms that they have in their existing religious practice or a non-practice just aren't quite cutting it. And for me, that wasn't really the case. I was interested in it because of the meditation aspect, which in Zen meditation, which is where I first started, it's a very large part of that practice. And for me, it was through martial arts and wanting to work on that a little bit. I'd heard that meditation helps that a great deal.
So your entry into Buddhism, in a sense, came through martial arts first.
Correct.
Where you have the Eastern influence, the discipline and control.
Yes.
And then you were attracted to the meditation part of the Buddhism. And I can see where the Zen would come in because of the discipline with the Zen as well. And you were introduced to the Zen Buddhist. Did you do it through, because a lot of people go through the literature first and then practice. Very few go practice literature. How did you do it?
Right, and for me it was practice literature, and that's often the case with Zen people. If they don't read Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, or one of the classics that's very available now, if they go to a meditation center, like a Zen center, they'll start with a practice, and they'll get an introductory session, and they'll have a few minutes of sitting and a little bit of talk about, well, here's what Buddhism is about, and here's what we teach, and here's the practice. And the Zen school in particular is very much about sitting, just the meditation. And there isn't as much the encouragement of scholastic work. There isn't and here's some books for you to read and study. That is there, but it's a much lesser part.
Did the scholarship part end up determining what school of Buddhism you were attracted to?
It did eventually.
It did.
As the practice itself was very much a just sit, and we'd still have classes, so there was still some basic education in the early Buddhism, and it's spread throughout China and Japan. There wasn't really an in-depth study of what that teaching was and how that all fit together. And it was only through independent study later, as the meditation itself wasn't really going anywhere. It was nice and it was very helpful, but I'd rather reached a block and there wasn't any progress, and I knew there was some more out there. That led me to a study of the early Buddhism, which is a vast amount of material available for that.
Okay. When you started with the Zen, was it the Zen Center here in Minneapolis?
So the Minnesota Zen Meditation Center.
Over on Parkway?
On Calhoun. Yep, on Calhoun.
Okay.
Yep, and that's been there for many years. Founded by Katagiri Roshi. And I, as I recall, the seed money for that was from that, partially funded by Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. A lot of that was helped to, Persig's book was used to help fund that center.
Okay. That's a nice little story to blend in with the start of it. And so you associated with the Zen Center for a period of time.
For many years, yes.
For many years.
Many years. I ended up becoming a doan, which is the bell ringer, the hunchback of evening sitting a couple times a week. And That was very helpful because one of the hardest things to do is to make sure that you sit, make sure that you actually do the practice. And it's one reason that one joins a community, is so that you do get the encouragement to actually do it instead of just talk about doing it. And becoming involved with a center in a capacity of, well, I don't have a lot of money right now, but I can help do this one service, helped me a great deal in that it made sure I did my sitting. And even if no one was there on a cold, wintry night on a Thursday for a couple of hours, I could make sure that I was there doing my sitting.
It's a very stark room. I've been in the Zen Center,
yes.
and it is stark. There is nothing in that room but a lot of space.
Yeah. The reference is that the Zen folks are the equivalent of the Quakers. Everything is black and white and very plain.
Yeah.
And the Tibetans are kind of Catholic. They got the big colorful hats, and so yeah, they're different distinctions.
That's kind of an interesting parallel look at it. Now, your present position has moved away from the Zen.
Correct.
And your practicing Buddhism now is a little different.
Yes, it's. I've had a migration, and it's not that Zen works very, very well for many people, and I will say the learning of the practice of meditation is very strong in that. What I was missing, though, was more the scholastic study, more of the book learning, more of the in-depth study of what the doctrine of original Buddhism was saying, because once I'd gotten a little bit of a taste of that, it struck me as being some of the guidance that I was missing in my meditation, and both in the whole framework that supported that meditation. We hadn't really gone into the depth that I wanted to, and having a background in sciences, that was very appealing to me. And that led me to a study of what is now called Theravada practice, which is original Buddhism. It literally means the elder school, Theravada.
Okay. Which would perhaps be a good time to make the transition to the founder of Buddhism in India.
Well, the cultural setting really needs to be painted, so you have a little bit of an understanding of what exactly we're talking about. It's 2,500 years ago. It's in the Ganges River Valley. And the caste system that we have today in that area, very strict lines of, these are the upper class, the lower class, the untouchables, and so on, weren't as highly developed, but it was still there. And it's referred to, I've seen it referred to as the proto-caste system.
Okay.
And in that culture religiously, primarily it was a Brahminic culture. Brahma was the chief god, and that was the main meat and drink religion of the time. However, there were many wandering ascetics of different faiths, and that was a common practice. So as we have our farmers market in downtown Minneapolis, they will have an ascetic market where people will be having their debates. The important thing that seems to be a thread of the time is that questioning was very encouraged. It was common for different ascetics to get together and debate and talk about the pluses and minuses, and to try to find out and understand the differences they'd have in their dogmas. So into that realm is born a person, and I'll make the distinction right away that when we talk about Buddha, that's a title.
Right.
It means enlightened one. It's not a name, although I was raised with it as a name, so I'm going to say Buddha as a name. Was born Siddhartha Gautama. His mother's family name was Gautami. And that was around, there are several different timelines given, but roughly 563 to 483 BCE near Nepal. And he was born into the Shakya clan, and is represented historically. His father was a king, and he was a prince, and very well-to-do, and historically more so his father was an elected chief, more so.
Okay.
So definitely someone of some means and benefit. But at age 29, so the stories go, he had found some inherent dissatisfactions. We can talk about that a little later. and left and said, I'm going into the homeless life because there's something not quite right here, even with this really, really great life I have. And for 6 years, became one of those wandering ascetics and learned everything he could until he had attained what they call his full enlightenment, his full awakening. And then for the next 45 years taught in that Ganges River Valley.
So he was not necessarily of royalty, but certainly of high rank.
Correct.
It is the Hindu faith we're speaking of in terms of their background.
Yes.
And that is a very, very old religion in itself, probably one of the oldest of the religions. And he is questioning some of the application of Hinduism, I would assume.
Yes.
And thus pursues this ascetic life, monastic in a sense. Is that?
Correct. And when one takes these days, if someone takes the homeless life, as they say, you go to a nice monastery, you're fed, you're taken care of. Back then, not so much. You take the homeless life, you are risking your life because you don't know where your next meal is coming from. You may not get one for several days. There are highwaymen and robbers, and there isn't so much necessarily a community for you to be a part of. There was no Buddhism for Buddha to be a part of, so he was on his own.
So this developed essentially from one individual, maybe because of his rank. It helped spread the word.
Spread the story goes, and we can go into the historic validity of that in a little bit, that he had led a very sheltered life, and that was by design. That his father had been told that, well, either he will be a great king of the world or he will be an enlightened one. And his father, of course, said, no, I want him to be a king like me, and so made sure that he was sheltered from everything and given just the best in life. But at one point, he had gotten out of the gates, so to speak, and he saw someone who was elderly and someone who was sick and someone who was dead. And that was quite a comeuppance. It was a deep realization that even with all these great benefits and this wonderful life, you still get old, you still get sick, you still die. And there's got to be some form of ending of this suffering, of this knowledge, of this happening. There has to be a breaking of this cycle.
It is really the idea of suffering and what happens to people that pulls him into this meditative life.
Yes.
And what his teachings. So much of, it seems to me, Buddhism is based on that it's out of compassion. A lot of compassion built into this
is
philosophy.
Very much built into it. The shortest summary that Buddha would have about what his doctrine was I teach suffering and the extinguishing of it. That's it. Nothing else. And everything leads and is connected directly to leading a life of greater happiness.
Okay.
And one of the things that I find as an atheist very appealing to that is it never makes any claims about, and the world started thus, and the universe was created thus, and it doesn't address those issues. They're not really relevant to the topic at hand.
And that has been my understanding, that the Buddha himself Siddhartha was not really interested in talking about doctrines of what the Western world would call spiritual things, Trinity and the like.
Right.
He was really interested in the practical side of life.
Yes.
And the schools that developed out of that, that follow the Buddha, one you associate with, which is the Theravada, the other is much more mystical. And so could you talk about the differences between those two schools?
Sure.
Which developed sometime later, I would assume, from the death of the Buddha.
Originally, the earliest records, so to speak, that we have of Buddhist talks is that it's very naturalistic. There's very little the supernatural involved with it whatsoever. When there are stories of deities and spirits, they really have nothing to do with the practice of the religion whatsoever. There's an acknowledgement that, well, yes, these exist, but when it comes down to the practice and the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, deities have nothing to do with it is based solely on one's own effort. And the basic inherent structure of self as identified in this, again, has nothing to do with a soul or a spirit or anything external or supernatural or something that one can't experience directly for oneself. So as that spread over time, what had occurred was, as it does with any faith that migrates out of its home territory, and over time, as other ideas influence it, it subsumes and gets subsumed by the local thoughts. So when you find Vajrayana, for example, making its way into Tibet, the Tibetan deities are inculcated into that religion, and you'll see them as the bodhisattvas. And we'll see that in many other religions as well, where they'll take historical figures or mythic figures from the existing area and incorporate them into their own views. So the same thing happens here, but what it would do is it would bring back into it mystical elements that otherwise had already been sort of shaken out. Yeah.
The Theravada goes south. If you looked at a map of Asia here, China's up here, and Vietnam's down here, and India's over here, and Sri Lanka's down here. Sri Lanka becomes sort of the focus of that.
It becomes it very much becomes the fort, so to speak, because as time went on, there were several different councils. As soon as Buddha had died at about age 80, Mahakassapa, one of the older monks of the time, realized that, we really need to sit down and make sure we all have the same understanding of what this doctrine is. And so they had the first council, and there were supposedly 500 monks there, and they all recited what the early Theravadan texts would have been. Now, when we talk about it being an oral tradition, because things weren't going to be written down for several hundred years yet, it's not an oral tradition in the way we as Westerners tend to think of it, where I tell you something and then you tell someone else, and by the time it gets 5 people down, it's a different story. With them, and this is part of the importance of chanting with this practice, is it's done as a group. And so as people do this, and it's done every couple of weeks, as they chant the core set of suttas that they have and the rules for the monks and so on, there's a consistency that's born out of a group doing it.
Okay, sure.
And then as these groups get together with others in the area, there's a reaffirmation of this. So that a couple of hundred years later, when they were having another one of the councils, they'd sit down and go through the recitations. And even though it had spread out and been several hundred years, there's very little mismatch. And the only differences that occurred were schisms within interpretation of rules for the monks and the nuns. They were, we think we should be able to carry salt with us. Literally, this is the kind of thing that that caused breaks in early Buddhism. So the teaching itself remained fairly constant. And then in Ashoka's time, it was carried to Sri Lanka in the 3rd century BCE. And Sri Lanka at that time was not a Buddhist country, but it was very quickly made into their national religion. And in 1st century BCE is when the canon was first written down in Sri Lanka. In Pali is what it's called. That isn't really the name of the language itself. The word Pali actually means text. And it's become, it tends to mean the text, the holy text of the religion is Pali. The language itself closely would have been Magadhan rather than Pali.
But so we take the Theravada, which goes south. Going up north, we could go to Tibet, but really the major school that is moving north is the Mahayana?
Yeah, Mahayana sees its early beginning in the 2nd century BCE, and that's when the Prajnaparamita literature is first composed. The Indian missionaries first got to China about then, during the Han Dynasty for Emperor Ming, but that really wasn't when it started soaking into Chinese culture yet. That would come sometime later. And then as I look at it, a few of the highlights: in the 4th century, Vajrayana develops in India, and that eventually would become the Tibetan practice we know it today. In the 6th century, Bodhidharma, who is the founder of Chan, which would then become Zen Buddhism,
Right.
he went from India to China, and that's really when things started hitting into China. And a dozen years later, Buddhism became the state religion of Japan.
Okay. And one of the distinctions I seem to get from these is that the Mahayana is more mystical or idealistic, and that the Theravada becomes much more realistic and in science, in a sense, based.
Well, the two different schools have some primary different interpretations. They all do still refer to the Pali Canon and the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. They do have that in common.
Right.
Where the difference is that Theravada has the view that one's own awakening, one's own enlightenment, is done solely through your own efforts. And that once one has that full enlightenment, you pass away and there's no coming back. It's everything is done. There is no remainder. Is how those suttas tend to end.
Okay.
With Mahayana, it takes the stance that that's a bit selfish, and so there the primary idea isn't the Tathagata and becoming a non-returner and you're done. The idea is to help others to attain that. So one takes the bodhisattva vow that I'll put off my own enlightenment until everybody else has already attained full nirvana.
Okay. Or enlightenment.
Or enlightenment.
Now, how does that between nirvana and enlightenment? Are they similar terms, like synonyms, or
similar terms?
Okay.
It's difficult to say one attains nirvana because it's not a place. It's not like you die and you go to heaven. You die and you go to nirvana.
Right.
It isn't that as an peeling away of all the things, all the gunk that we have on ourselves, all of the distractions, all of the hindrances we have in our daily lives, until those are finally completely gone and there's no remainder, and all that's left is that wonderful, quiet oneness of nirvana.
Okay. Now, you touched briefly upon texts that are important to the study. Part of that was the canon. Part of that would be a discussion of the sutras. Some of these are, as I understand, very, very long.
Oh, yes.
And then there are some, and I think it's the Heart Sutra, which you could literally put on a teacup, someone said, that it's so short. So there's quite a variety in terms of the sutras and the texts.
Yes. Of the two different branches, and we'll just talk about the Theravada and the Mahayana sets of text. The Theravada it's known as the Tipitaka, meaning the three baskets. Tipitaka being the Pali term, and if you hear Tripitaka, that's, not Pali, the Sanskrit version.
Yes.
They're related languages. And it's very large. Of those three baskets, you have the Vinaya in 6 volumes, and that's the rules for the monks and nuns.
Okay.
Monks have at least 227 set rules of behavior. So perhaps you can see why the Mahayana folks thought, wow, that's a little hidebound. Maybe we can relax on the whole carrying salt thing. And the suttas themselves, which is 5 collections, not 5 books, 5 collections of books. And then the third basket is the Abhidhamma in 7 books, 7 volumes, and that's really the nuts and bolts, esoteric, really looking down deep at everything that leads to what is self and consciousness.
Okay.
The mass of that is, I've seen various estimates on the web. Most recently was 11 times the size of the Bible, that's a lot of stuff. And then there's also commentaries and sub-commentaries. And then with Mahayana, the greater vehicle, just looking at some of their texts, they have the Heart Sutra, which is chanted every week at most Zen centers, and that one is fairly short, and that one you have a bodhisattva, Avalokiteshvara, one of the deities, kind of poking fun at Shariputra, who was, in Theravada, he is Buddha's right-hand man. He was the one who was most learned in the teaching itself. And the Diamond Sutra, which talks about impermanence, not being nihilism, goes into that in detail. And then the Lotus Sutra is probably the largest of the Mahayana texts that we'd talk about. And that it's very large, and it does a very good job of doing an analysis of the doctrine, but it also is very, very heavy with the mystical elements.
Okay. That's where you'd start to go levitating up into the ether.
Right, and the Mahayana texts, their beginning is listed as being, well, these were written at the same time as the old stuff, but it was hidden away by dragons.
Oh.
The Nagas kept them in caves.
Oh.
So there's a mystical beginning to the texts,
Sure.
which always makes my atheist hackles rise, that I want to see a little more of that. If you look at it as historical documentation, if you do an analysis of all of it, you can really see that, well, in the older school, this one predates this one, not just in the flavor of the language, but because this refers to this one.
Yeah.
And Buddha's son was only 7 in this one, and he's an adult here. So with that, you can kind of piece together the order of it. You see the same thing with the Mahayana, that it refers to things much earlier, and the language itself is very, very different.
We're getting toward the end of this first segment, and we still haven't talked briefly. I guess we could talk about the devotion and faith that we tend to be really strong on in the Western religions.
Yes. Yeah.
Buddhism addresses faith in a slightly different way, and if you have maybe 30 seconds, could you
Sure.
sum that up and about that?
In theistic practice, it involves acceptance and obedience to the supernatural. Supernatural wins out. In Buddhism, the word for faith, the Pali word, is saddha, which it means faith, but it has the connotation of from direct experience.
Okay.
It has more so the meaning of confidence rather than accepting it. It's completely naturalistic. You aren't expected to accept anything that you can't test for yourself.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ted. I now have confidence in Buddhism, and at least for the foundation. And we want to pursue this in another segment where we'll look more at the application of Buddhism in a person's life and continue this theme of how atheism and Buddhism, in at least the Theravada type,
Yes.
could be comparable or work together rather nicely. So I want to thank you for your participation in this Atheist Talk program tonight. Minnesota Atheists want to thank you for listening and participating as an audience in this program this evening. If you have any questions or have any interest in pursuing this, note our website and contact us. If you do, you may get a free copy of our newsletter, The Minnesota Atheist. And remember, if you're interested in us, we are interested in you. Thank you.